recording, and welcome to our Zoom class. My name is Cassie Anderson. I am the Master Gardener Coordinator in Adams County, and I love vegetable gardening, so it was really fun and easy to put this class together. Today we're pretty much just going to be talking about tomatoes and some tips and tricks about how to make sure that your tomatoes do as best as they can. Tomatoes, I like to say, are the divas of the vegetable garden, or the princesses of the vegetable garden. Everybody wants to grow them. Everybody wants to have them a part of their garden. It's usually the very first thing that somebody says they want to grow when they are thinking about starting a vegetable garden, but they are actually not one of the easiest plants to grow. They tend to be picky about how they get watered, picky about their temperatures. They are susceptible to a lot of different problems, and so it can be really easy to have things not quite work out right. So it can be a little bit frustrating. So hopefully some of the tips and tricks that we'll get into today will be helpful for making sure that you have success with your tomatoes. So tomatoes are really cool because there are such great variety within them. I mean, you've got anything from the little tiny currant size to the massive beefsteak tomatoes, and all kinds of different colors. If you've never tried something like a black Krim or a green zebra tomato, there's just so much diversity, so many options that you can choose for your tomatoes. Or maybe you're just really traditional, you like that salad slicer tomato, and to keep it simple. Nothing wrong with that either. Some of the hybrid tomatoes give you a really consistent crop, and so you really know what you're getting. Or if you're looking for canning up your own tomatoes, there's a lot of really good options there as well. So when you're thinking about planting tomatoes, it's important to know how much the growing conditions can affect the taste of your tomatoes. If you're watering inconsistently, you can get things like blossom end rot, which we'll talk about a little bit more in depth later. You can get cracking in your fruit. If your soil is not ideal, then your tomatoes might not grow as well. They usually like a neutral pH soil up to about 7.5 pH, and that neutral is a 6 or is a 7. So they're usually like somewhere right in the neutral level of pH, but they can tolerate a little bit higher up to that 7.5. I forgot to make the note of, just for security purposes, if anything does happen in this talk, we will just close the talk down, and we'll try and readmit everybody if we've still got time. There have been some instances of Zoom hacking happening, and so we just want to make sure that everything is safe in that regard. I forgot to mention that at the beginning. And also, we will open up the chat to questions once I'm near to wrapping up the talk. So you'll be able to ask a lot of questions near the end, where we definitely booked this with lots of extra time so that we can answer questions at the end of things that I didn't address, or if you want more details. So back to the slide. Tomatoes are also very particular about temperature. If nighttime temperatures are too low, or we have cool days or very, very hot days, then the tomatoes don't necessarily like it very much. And tomatoes tend to have better flavor if you can leave them to ripen on the vine. Obviously, when you're harvesting in mid-September or early October with your very last few tomatoes, it's not always possible to keep them on the vine, and we will talk about some options if you get to that point as well. Generally speaking, there are two types of tomatoes with kind of a third subtype that's becoming slightly more popular. There are the determinate tomatoes, and I apologize in advance, I mix up the potato and the tomato word. If I say potato, I mean tomato. It's something that is always twisted up in my brain. So tomatoes, you have determinate and indeterminate types of tomatoes. The determinate type are usually more of a bushy type. They don't typically grow more than about 3 to 5 feet tall, and they bear the majority of their fruit in one big flush. These are really popular when you're looking at like your canning varieties, your Roma, your paste tomatoes, the things that you're planning to, you want to get one big harvest, you want to cook it all at once, and you want to be done with it. And so generally speaking, that's a really nice way to go when you're getting that one big crop in. The indeterminates are the ones that most of you are probably more familiar with. These are more of the vining tomato. They continue to grow and set fruit throughout the season, but they do keep growing and growing and growing. There are some really cool pictures out there of tomatoes that have filled an entire greenhouse because they were able to keep it growing and fed and happy for long enough that it pretty much filled up to the roof of the greenhouse and just kept growing. So with that, when you're working with indeterminate tomatoes, you definitely need to stake them or cage them to make sure that you have good airflow, to make sure that you get a better crop overall. There is a newer variety, the semi-determinates, which is also a bush type. They grow a little bit taller and they grow several flushes of fruit. They do need caging just because they do get bigger than the determinates. But there aren't very many of the semi-determinates out on the market just yet. So usually you're going to see either the determinate or the indeterminate. And it's important when you're planning out your garden and your space to know what type that you've got. So in terms of the categories of tomatoes, it's nice to know when you're planning what you want to grow, that what kind of tomato you want. I mean, for myself personally, I never buy paste tomatoes because I'm not much of a fan of cooked tomatoes. I will eat raw tomatoes until the cows come home, but cooked tomatoes are not my thing. So I will look for the cherry tomatoes and the salad slicers and the beef steaks instead of those canning or paste tomatoes. But all of the varieties have their benefits. And honestly, a lot of the paste tomatoes aren't terrible to eat fresh. They just are better in some ways when they are cooked. They have certain qualities, which I'll get into in a couple slides. So generally speaking, there's several different sizes of tomatoes. There are the currant tomatoes, which are really, really tiny. The more common cherry tomatoes, which are usually up to 1 inch in diameter. The salad slicers, which are kind of like, you can hold them comfortably in your fist. The canning or paste tomatoes, which often you'll see are kind of in that longer, slender shape, although they don't have to be. And then, of course, the beef steaks. Usually they're fairly wide. Usually they're pretty hefty. Usually that's kind of the gold star goal for a lot of people in growing their tomatoes. They want that beefsteak tomato on their burger on the 4th of July, which is very hard to accomplish here in Colorado. So cherry tomatoes are a smaller cherry-sized fruit. The plants can range in size from a very tiny dwarf. There are container varieties of tomatoes if you're growing in containers. All the way up to plants that can grow 6 feet or beyond if you really give them the resources, although not usually if you're growing outside in Colorado. Usually when you're planting a cherry tomato, you don't want to plant more than 1, maybe 2 plants of cherries. They're really, really prolific. I mean, there are tons of cherry tomatoes that can be available or that you can get off of 1 plant. Even if you've got a large, relatively voracious family, maybe 2 plants is going to be your maximum for the cherry tomatoes. They're really tempting though because there's so many different varieties and colors and shapes. I really like these pear-shaped tomatoes. But there's I'll get into some varieties in a little bit. And you can use them for all kinds of different purposes. They're really good for snacking. They're really good for putting on your salads. They're very multi-purpose. They generally tend a little bit more to be sweet than the really rich, earthy flavors of some of the bigger ones, but that's not always true. There are exceptions in all of these categories. The salad slicers are the kind of that grocery store standard, the one that you see at the grocery store and you can almost always guarantee will be a fairly consistent shape and fairly consistent size, although not always a consistent color. There are a lot of salad slicers that are more diverse colors or shapes or whatnot. They can come both as indeterminate and determinate varieties. Usually the tomatoes are going to be smooth skinned. If you do get to the point in the season where you've still got mature sized fruit, but they're still green, you can ripen them on the counter. And they have a wide variety of uses. You can, obviously, the name salad slicer, you can put them in your salad. You can put them in your soups. You can stuff them or put them in the oven and cook them with a full English breakfast. I mean, the options for the salad slicers are pretty broad. The canning and pasting tomatoes are often, but not always, that kind of plum shape, that little bit longer than they are wide shape. Usually the distinction for the canning and pasting tomatoes is that they have a lot of sugars and acids, a lot of pectin, and much less water. The cavities where the seeds are usually very small. You get a lot of flesh to fruit ratio with the canning or paste tomatoes. And if you're growing these guys, fairly often they are, like I said, going to be that typically going to be that determinate type, so that you get that one big crop that you can really harvest at once and process at once. If you're really seeking the best possible flavor when you're canning and paste tomatoes are reaching maturity, it's important to cut back on how you're feeding them and how you're watering, or cut back on feeding and cut back on watering to really help those flavors concentrate in the fruit. And of course, beefsteak tomatoes, everybody's end goal, it feels like. These are the largest tomatoes. Sometimes they can be over 2 pounds, not 12 pounds. You almost invariably, beefsteaks are going to be indeterminate. Many of them take a very long time to mature. Like I said, fairly often you hear people have that goal of that giant beefsteak tomato slice that they can put on their burger at the 4th of July. You need to start your plants inside very early, and you need to make sure that you've got some way to warm your soil significantly if you're going to make that as kind of your goal. And they are going to give you the very best taste if you leave them on the vine to ripen, although they can counter ripen as well if you need to. So here is, if you have a screenshot option, if you want to take a picture, although I will be sending you a handout that I think has all of these varieties on it as well at the end of this talk. Some good choices of varieties of all of these different types. So if you're looking for those cherry tomatoes, Sun Gold is like the industry standard for good, sweet flavor, massive production. It wins the Taste Off Award almost every year, I believe, in a tasting that Denver holds. Yellow pear tomatoes are a fun one. They are pear-shaped. They go bright yellow. Sweet 100 is one of the easiest ones to find, especially if you're buying plants from a nursery. Peace Vine is a more unique one that you can find usually more as a seed, so it might be a little late to find that guy this year. For your slicers, I went with the more unique ones for choices here. Black Truffle is going to be a very nice dark purple tomato, and Green Zebra is one that's always really fun. When you're picking your tomatoes that are different colors, it might take some guess and check time to figure out how they really look. Usually for the green ones, you'll see a little bit of a blush start on the blossom end of the fruit, and that can indicate to you. You can give it a gentle feel and see how it's feeling, if it feels like it's starting to soften up when you're testing to see if it's ripe. For paste tomatoes, one of the standards is a very good one, is the Amish paste. Speckled Roman, which is the one pictured here, is just a fun one because of its unique appearance, but also a very good one flavor-wise. Beefsteak tomatoes, of course, this is the one everyone wants to hear about. Cherokee Purple is one of my favorite tomatoes. I got one from the place I buy my tomatoes at this year that is a little stunted. They weren't selling it to most people, but they knew that I have grown a lot of plants in my time, and so let me try and nurse it. So hopefully I can nurse it back to health. Prudence Purple is another absolutely stellar tomato. It makes a big beefsteak shape, and it's just a really good choice. Brandywine is one of the traditional heirloom varieties that everyone thinks of, and it has such a rich and incredible flavor that it's a really nice choice. So it's definitely good to kind of look at your options, and if there's a name that you've never heard before, give it a shot. Do a quick Google search, see what the descriptions say on a couple different websites, and do make sure that you look at what disease resistances they have. If you're buying heirloom varieties, then they're not going to be as disease resistant. So if you have disease problems in your yard historically, then you might want to stick with hybrids that have better disease resistance for the future, or for the near future, for a few years. All right, so you've got your garden ready, you're ready to start thinking about planting your tomatoes. When is a good time? We timed this talk for this week because now is actually getting to be a perfect time to transplant those tomatoes. You want to make sure that we're free of frost for the night, that our soil temperatures are between 60 and 65 degrees, and you can do that with using a soil thermometer or even an old kitchen thermometer. Stick it in the ground 4 to 6 inches deep, and test where the soil temperature is at that depth to make sure that the soils are warm enough. If the soils aren't warm, if you've got a spot that was slow to warm up this year, then you might want to try and warm it with some mulching methods, or get some wall of water, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Do something to warm that soil, because these guys, like I said, they're princesses. They're going to get in that cold soil and they're just going to sulk. Fairly often they will grow much slower if you plant them in cool soils, even if you plant them much earlier than if you plant them in soil that is an appropriate temperature. And you want your daytime temperatures to be consistently above 60 degrees. If it gets below 55 degrees, plants will definitely get stunted. For this year, it looks like we're in the clear, at least down here along the Front Range. I don't know if we've got folks who are in the mountain areas or in other parts of the state, but here along the Front Range, we're doing pretty well, and we should be pretty good to go in terms of planting tomatoes for cold temperatures. You can also provide frost protection. So I talked about that wall of water, and wall of water can provide protection down to the mid-teens. Of course, it only does it for the part that's protected. So when you've got leaves that are popping up out of the top of the wall of water like this, those guys will not be protected from cold temperatures. And you can use a plastic mulch like there is in this picture to make sure that you're warming that soil up as well. If you have raised beds, your soils are much more likely to be warmer than if you have in-ground beds. And so it's just kind of a decision that you make on your own. If you are looking to purchase transplants, you want to make sure that you're buying them with a nice grassy green color. You want them to be somewhere between 6 and 8 inches tall. I don't know if you can see both of my hands. 6 to 8 inches tall. You don't want them to be really big. You definitely don't want them to have flowers on them. Or heaven forbid, fruit. I so often go to the nurseries this time of year and I see somebody carting around this massive tomato that's got like whole sets of fruit already on it, and they think, oh, I've got such a head start on things, I'm gonna have that 4th of July tomato, it's gonna be great. But those really big plants are a lot more susceptible to transplant stress, and so it's going to take them a lot longer to get ready and to get growing well. So it's really good to find one that does not have any flowers and any fruit. If there are some flowers and it's a good looking plant otherwise, you can pinch those flowers off before you plant it. If the plant starts to look a little bit leggy, then it's probably because it's been really warm and it's been maybe deprived of a little bit of light. You want them to be nice and dense plants. This one, you can see there's a little tiny bit of purpling. This is actually one of mine for this year that I haven't planted out yet. We did have a couple cool nights, and that purpling is just a little bit of stress from cool, but they should grow out of it just fine. If they have a little bit of purpling, it's not the worst thing. So you've got your tomatoes, they're in good shape, you want to make sure that you plant them. So if you're going to plant, there's a lot of different ways you can plant a tomato. One of the best ways to get good results is to plant it actually a little bit horizontally in a trench in the soil. So I've got both a diagram and a real picture here. The reason for this is because tomatoes really readily send out adventitious roots. If they are under soil, they will root along that entire stem. When you plant it sideways like that, you're giving it a lot of good surface area to send out new roots, and you're going to get a lot stronger growth out of your tomato overall. You want to have about 2 sets of leaves above the soil surface. Anything that's going beneath the soil, you can pinch those leaves off. And so that's going to get you a really good result. And you want to make sure that your soil is nicely moistened before you plant and after you put those tomatoes in. If you are planning to plant your tomatoes, you do want to also make sure that they are hardened off nicely and ready to go out. And if it's a warm day, make sure that they're either under some shade while you're waiting to transplant them, or at least have a good amount of water on their roots while you're waiting to transplant. Once you've got them in, it's a really good idea to mulch your pretty much all of your garden. It can reduce how much you need to irrigate. It can reduce how much you need to weed. So there's a lot of benefits to mulch. Grass clippings are a really great way to mulch. You can get, if you can find it, weed-free straw is also a really good option. It can be a little bit harder to find. And make sure, if you're doing a grass clipping, that you apply it in thin layers and let it dry out. If you put like 4 inches of grass mulch down, it's going to turn into a slimy, wet mess. So not usually the best thing. If you are treating your lawn with herbicides or pesticides, you want to wait at least a month until after your application before you put that mulch or put new clippings on from that area. Make sure you give your tomatoes room to grow. Plant spacing is going to give you so much better production. You'll get much better yield if your plants are spaced appropriately. This means sometimes as much as 2 feet in between each plant. The better air circulation is going to improve your disease, reduce your risk of disease. And generally speaking, if you can grow up, you're going to get a lot more crop than if you're just spreading out. Or if you're really cramming them in together, then there's just not going to be room for them to get the resources they need, i.e. sunlight and water. So giving them extra space. Every year I say that this year I am going to make my tomatoes into espaliers, like the fruit trees that are smushed against or flattened against a wall. Every year I say I'm going to do it. I don't think I'm going to say I'm going to do it this year because I don't have time, but it's a long-term goal for me to try espaliering tomatoes and see what the production is like then when they've got really good airflow and production. And when you give them good room, you get much easier harvests. You don't have to be digging around in there, scrounging around in there, because everything is on show. You can see it all. I will confess, I have had a couple years where my tomatoes have been ground growing, vining soil covers, essentially, because I didn't get any caging or any structure on them in time. And you still get decent crop, but your risk for disease, your risk for insect problems, your risk for not finding the fruit and then suddenly it's a rotten mess is all much, much higher if you don't get them nicely trellised. Kind of the same concept here, just a different idea of how you could trellis. Another image of different material you could use to trellis your tomatoes. Notice the spacing. If you want to make a really strong cage, I know you can buy those tomato cages from the big box stores, and they look so cute, and some of them are super bright colors, but they're pretty weak and they're actually pretty small. So a really good way to make a tomato cage is to get concrete reinforcing mesh or cattle grate fencing from your local ranch store. Cut it 6.5 feet long by 2 feet across, and Just wrap it into a ring. Remove the very bottom part so that you actually have bits of the wire that will stick straight into the ground, and that's going to be a much stronger support than those little cages that you buy from the big box stores. All right. Tomatoes are definitely they definitely do need fairly substantial fertilization, but they are also picky if they get over fertilized. So when you're starting your tomatoes, you want to give them a little bit of a feed when you plant them, and at about 2-week intervals afterwards, depending on how much soil organic matter you have. If you have a lot of organic matter in your soil, you can reduce how much you're applying fertilizer for sure. And it's totally up to you whether you use a conventional fertilizer or an organic fertilizer. The plant is going to take them up pretty much the same. The important thing is just to get a nice balanced fertilizer. And so once you've got that first couple of fertilizers down, then you usually can wait a little bit and mid-season give them another little feed. This can help reduce risks of things like early blight, and then give them another, for a standard tomato or a beefsteak tomato, when the fruits are about 2 inches in size, you can give them another shot of nitrogen. And for those of you who aren't familiar, when you're reading your plant label, the numbers on the label tell you how much of each fertilizer type are in it. The first number is your nitrogen, second is your phosphorus, third is your potassium. That's why I included this guy. Okay, so I'm a little slower than I intended to be. I'm getting distracted by talking about things I like to talk about. Getting into the nitty-gritty when I talk about tomatoes being princesses, some of the various things that can go wrong. If you're looking at environmental issues, blossom end rot. This is a calcium deficiency, but it's usually due to poor watering practices or cold soils. Typically, as our soils warm up and we water more reliably, the fruit will stop exhibiting blossom end rot problems. It's not going to be something that's killing the plant, it's not killing the fruit, and if you're really determined to eat that tomato, you can cut that bad part off and you can try the rest. It's probably not going to have as good a taste as the rest. You can also have problems like root rot or cat facing. Root rot is going to be too much water. Cat facing happens usually when we have big swings in temperature change. Zippering is something, it's completely cosmetic, usually an environmental stressor. Your fruit might split, and that usually is due to erratic watering. Sun scald might look a little bit like the yellowing part on this picture with the blossom end rot. Usually it's too much sun. Believe it or not, our tomatoes, it's a warm season plant, but they don't like really high temperatures. So you can shade it a little bit. If you get a very thin, fine shade cloth, maybe 15 or 10 or 20% shade, that can help reduce risk of sun scald. And if you have green or yellow shoulders, then during ripening, the fruit got, or the temperatures got really high. Disease is one I don't have time to get into the nitty-gritties, but there are a lot of diseases that tomatoes can get. They can get early blight or septoria leaf spot, cucumber mosaic virus, fusarium wilt, bacterial canker, tomato spotted wilt virus. And like I said, I don't have time to get into the details of these various viruses. Most of them, there's not much we can do about it. You rogue that plant out, you take it out, you make sure you sterilize any of your support materials for the next year. And there's a lot of information on this in our fact sheet, Recognizing Tomato Problems, which we will be sending out to you after this class. Then we've got our insect problems. So there are some insects that like our tomatoes. Psyllids are an annual pest that migrate in. They usually can be identified because they leave kind of a sugar substance on the leaves. Flea beetles leave tiny holes in the leaves. Actually, there's a good picture of flea beetles. I saw the damage while I was talking on this guy. These leaves, that looks like it could be flea beetle damage. Tomato hornworms, these are voracious munchers. This top picture, they'll eat the entire leaves and plant. Be aware with the tomato hornworm, they do mature into the sphinx moth, which most people love. So if you really if you can stand it, if you can designate a sacrificial tomato, maybe it's a variety that you got from somebody else and you don't really care for, maybe you can let them at least go through their life cycle so they can mature into a mature sphinx moth. Although there are a lot of other varieties of sphinx moths that don't eat our precious tomatoes. They're pretty easy to control. They're so big that you can pull them off. If you've got chickens, then they're a great snack for the chickens. I do know people who take them and actually cut them in half with a pair of scissors if you really feel like vindictive against them. Whitefly and aphids usually are annual pests. They're usually escaped greenhouse pests. Sometimes you might just, they may have come with an egg on one of your plants if you bought it from a greenhouse. Usually there's not much damage from those guys. And stink bugs feed on the fruit and cause discoloration of the fruit. So generally speaking, one of the things we get a lot of calls for is, why don't I have any fruit? Why are my flowers dropping? When temperatures get over 85 degrees during the day or 70 degrees at night, or if temperatures get below 55 degrees, the tomatoes will get grumpy. They stop wanting to do anything. They just kind of sit there and they sulk. And so fairly often you won't get good fruit set when those temperatures are really high, whether it's daytime or nighttime temperatures. And also a very common problem, we see folks who are just, they're feeding their plants every week or every other week with a big feed, and they say, I've got these beautiful plants, they're almost like trees, but I have no flowers and no fruit. You're giving those plants everything they need to just keep growing. They have no motivation, and I'm anthropomorphizing them here a little bit, but they have no motivation to set fruit. So they're definitely not going to get there if you keep fertilizing them as much. So if you're getting really lush green growth, lots of it, no flowers, no fruit, cut back on the fertilizer, and that should help. Why do we plant these things again? They have so many different problems, but they taste so good. They give us a good challenge with a satisfying endpoint. They're fun, they smell amazing. If you want some good reading, The $64 Tomato by William Alexander that was put out in 2006 is a really fun read about, we start gardening, we think, oh, I'm gonna save so much money, and then you end up putting this huge garden infrastructure in and putting all this fertilizer on, and it can be, and then suddenly losing your whole crop to some kind of unknown or unforeseen disease or pest issue. So they can be frustrating, but they can be really rewarding when it does go right. All right, you've eked your tomatoes through the season. You've started to get some harvest. Generally speaking, tomatoes, when they're ripe, are going to break off decently well. And you can tell that they get to this point that we call breakers. Usually if they're at the breaker point, then they're kind of this faint blush color, and they're usually at that point close to being ripe. And so if we have a frost in our future, you can definitely pull them off. One of the big things to note when you are harvesting your tomatoes, it's really easy to want to reach in there and just pull it off. And I don't know, myself and I have a neighbor who loves to just take them and eat them like an apple. It's really better for the plant, for the longevity of the plant, if you actually clip it off with a pair of scissors. You don't want to tear the plant itself while you're pulling your plant off, as tempting as it might be. Some of them are going to ripen much better, or remove but much better if you pull it, but a lot of them hold on pretty tightly. All right, and some of our softer tomatoes, the really big ones, the black ones or beefsteaks, you should harvest just before they're really ripe, when they're like at 90% color. And you can let them sit on your counter for a couple of days to really get to the point of ripening after that. And then of course, how to taste a tomato. The sugars, the sweetness of the tomato is stored in the flesh of the fruit. Acid is going to be in the gel surrounding the seeds. So it's really important to balance out the flavor between them and eat them together to really get that full experience of the tomato flavor itself. All right. So that is the end. It looks like I've got all kinds of questions coming in. Let me pull the questions over so I'm looking at them more easily. Oh my, lots of questions. How to tell what your pH is, Sharon? That's a definite, excellent question. Your pH is going to be determined best by getting a soil test. That's something we always recommend you do when you're starting a new garden. Erin is asking about sharing tricks on pinching. I didn't have time with this talk to really get into pruning tomatoes. Pinching fairly often, so you'll have your tomato plant and you've got the main stem and the branch going off, and then you'll get these little suckers that grow in between. And when a lot of times to really keep your plant growth reduced, people suggest pinching that off. I have fingernails, so I actually just use my fingernail and I cut them off, but you can use a pair of scissors too. Tomatoes do need very much full sun, 6 to 8 hours a day. Good varieties for containers. Anything that says it's a bush variety, anything that says that it is compact growing. I don't have any names off the top of my head, but one thing that is nice, if you're growing your tomatoes in a container, it keeps them a little bit smaller, even if they are an indeterminate tomato. You do want to use a big container. You want a 15-gallon pot of some kind, and you want that whole thing to be soil. So you'll usually, you don't want to like fill half of it with filler or anything. You want that whole area for roots to grow into. Usually a 15-gallon pot is like 18 or 20 inches across. Joyce asked what hardening off is. So hardening off is the process in which we make sure that our plants are ready to be outside. Usually if you started your plants inside, or if your plants started their life in a greenhouse, they're used to very uniform temperatures, very uniform environment. And so you set them outside in increasing length intervals to prep them for being outside. There's another one on container growing. I think I covered that pretty decently. To use wall of waters or not, it's really up to you. Wall of water will let you get your plants in the ground sooner. You definitely can use the wall of water to warm that soil and start your season sooner, or you can wait and then you might not get a crop quite as early. When you plant the tomatoes, why horizontal? Can you plant them really deep? Won't they send out roots just the same? So the reasoning, and I suppose I tried to touch on it, but I didn't probably explain it well enough. When your plant roots want oxygen and want warm temperatures. So when you're planting all of those roots near the soil surface, they're going to get water, they're going to get nutrients a lot more quickly if they're up near the surface, and then if you just planted the whole thing really deep and straight down. So the horizontal just gets you better root exposure to the things that those roots need to grow well. Another one for containers. I should have put a slide in on containers, I'm sorry. How do we extend the life of container tomatoes? I'm not sure, in terms of keeping them, like, I'm not sure what you're asking there. If you're, like, you can bring them in for a little while, but fairly often pests are gonna kind of overtake the plants if you've had them outside for a while. Melanie, your soils are not cold, you consistently water, you're not calcium deficient, and you still have blossom end rot. My guess is that, I mean, yeah, that one, maybe you could send me an email. I've got my email up on the screen here and we could chat a little bit more. There's a couple other, I mean, usually the blossom end rot, it's cool soils and too much water. So maybe it can be, or too much water can contribute to it. So maybe make sure that it dries out with some water afterwards, or shoot me an email. Do I follow the Farmer's Almanac on good planting days? There is not much scientific substantiation behind the planting days. Usually I just wait until our forecasts look good and our soil temperatures are warm enough. don't really follow the Farmer's Almanac, no. Wondering about single stem pruning. Does aggressive pruning work well in our hot and dry climate? If you can keep them growing and happy enough, you can be pretty aggressive with the tomatoes. You do, of course, want to have enough leaves that it can keep supporting itself. How often do you water? Watering is going to be one of those wonderful it depends situations. If you've got a raised bed, you're going to be watering more often than if you have an in-ground bed. If you have a container, you'll be watering more often. Usually our fingers are really good at telling how moist the soil is. So if you put your finger up to your first knuckle into the soil, then you can, if it's dry down there, you want to make sure you give it a water. Do let them dry out a little bit. You don't want them to have really wet roots. That's how you get root rot. That's how you get other disease issues. How do they grow inside? Not very well unless you've got really supplemental light and a lot of good air movement. Generally speaking, they're going to be a much better choice for outside. Watering schedule, it's going to depend, like I said, on your exact situation, and really you want to just kind of look and see how long it takes for your soils to start to dry out a little bit, and make sure that you're watering as needed. Not too much, but definitely not too little. When should you start tomatoes indoors in Denver? We end up with flowering plants that are much larger than you said. Usually I didn't put that in here because I was trying to keep it short so that we could do Q&A. But usually you want to start your seeds about somewhere between 4 to 6 weeks before the last frost date. So mid to late March is usually a pretty good time to start seeds inside. And just make sure if you do get flowers, then just kind of pinch them off. You can definitely have larger tomatoes. It gives you more surface area. You can pinch up those leaves and plant it a little bit deeper, but it's not necessary to have a bigger plant. What are some safe ways to get rid of insects? Most of the insects are really not things that you need to spray pesticides on. We do, that fact sheet that we'll be sending you has some good information, and a lot of it can be as simple as manual removal, like with the tomato hornworm. Better varieties for growing at 9,000 feet. Do you have a greenhouse? I would really say without a greenhouse, you're not going to get a lot of luck. The best thing would probably be to get some bush cherry varieties. Eric put in soil testing information, just scrolling through. Make a recommendation regarding humic or fulvic minerals to our soil. Really for that, I would suggest that you get a soil test with that link right above and make sure that you're only adding things that you have a deficiency in. Yes, it's definitely an old wives' tale to plant a fish under the tomato plant. I suppose it would give you nitrogen, but really we can do that in so many more efficient ways than having something rotting underneath our tomato plant. So definitely working there. Another one for high elevation tomatoes, smaller container cherry tomatoes. Yeah, and with the banana peel or Epsom salts, they're only going to be the Epsom salts is magnesium. It's going to be beneficial if you're lacking. Very rarely are we lacking in magnesium. Yeah, if for Cindy, she says she's removed suckers but gets less tomatoes. Yeah, if you're removing things, you're going to have less fruit or less leaf area, and you could get less production. It's totally up to you whether you're going to prune them or not. Some people are really determined that you have to prune. Some people are really determined you don't have to prune. It's kind of up to you either way. Container gardens, watering with drip. There are all kinds of little drippers that you can add to a 1/4 inch irrigation tubing. You can get them in different flow rates. Definitely, I think doing a drip system on container gardens is a great way to go because they need it, especially if you can put it onto a timer, because they need it more frequently. If you have problems like flea beetles and rotate the crops to another nightshade plant, yeah, the flea beetles are pretty indiscriminate. They'll hop from plant to plant, although thankfully they do tend to have a fairly short season. So is it possible to plant horizontal and container growing? I suppose for container growing, you're using a different media. You're not going to be planting in a mineral soil, so you're going to have better porosity in your soil, so you definitely can plant more vertically in a container application. Tomatoes, we do have to plant every year. They definitely are annuals. Oh, and Eric answered that. Yep, we plant them as annuals here. So Susan, for daily drip for 20 minutes in a pot, it's really going to depend on how fast your dripper is, how big your pot is, that kind of thing. The ideal fertilizer ratio, I would really focus more on something that has a higher nitrogen, lower phosphorus, potassium. The exact numbers are not going to be, aren't as important. Other plants that should be planted horizontally, there's actually not very many that we plant horizontally. It looks like Eric's catching up on some of these. Should you ever water more than once a day? In a container application, I would say watering more than once a day, but raised beds usually should have enough moisture retention. Watering from below, definitely preferred. Drip irrigation is going to be a much better. I'm not familiar with growing with an AeroGarden, Joyce, but yeah, you can start tomatoes inside and then transplant outside. Just make sure you harden them off before you bring them out. You can water with a hose, but yes, you want to grow at the ground level. Nikki, yes, it would probably be a good idea to pinch those small tomatoes on your plant off. Compost tea's effectiveness with tomatoes. Compost tea is essentially just a very dilute fertilizer, so you can use it. There's not a lot of research showing that it does anything that regular fertilizers don't. It's going to be much, much lower in nitrogen. Which Eric answered as well. Scrolling down. All right, looks like we're getting through a lot of oh, Estelle, thank you for that feedback. We are definitely looking at doing more Zoom style classes like this. We definitely seem to get really good attendance and appreciate everybody coming in. So if you do have further questions, I'm going to keep scrolling through because there's quite a few, but you can definitely also shoot me an email. My email's up here, or message us on Facebook, or send our Master Gardeners an email as well. 4-inch tall tomatoes, Amy. Yes, I think you could probably, as long as you've got true leaves and there's at least 2 to 3 sets of leaves, then you can probably plant them out. Just make sure you're keeping on top of keeping them moist. Straw is a great mulch for the vegetable garden if you can find a weed-free straw. Grass clippings have nitrogen. I wouldn't say they're really, really high in nitrogen. I have not bought all of my nursery plants. I still am planning to buy a couple nursery tomatoes this weekend. I haven't planted any of my tomatoes yet, so I think this is a great weekend to go out and buy some tomatoes and get them planted in the ground. Julie, we are recording this, so you'll be able to watch this on YouTube, on our Adams County Master Gardener YouTube page, which we'll post on our Facebook page as well. That's right. I also wanted to put, Eric, it looks like, can you start the poll? Looks like since you're logged in, I need you to start the poll. But we do have a poll for you guys if you don't mind filling out a bit of a poll. Joyce, yes, we do other classes on other vegetables, plants, and flowers. We've done a whole bunch this spring, and we've got 3 more that you'll be hearing about in the email that we're sending. And I cannot recommend a nursery, but our local nurseries are all excellent, so definitely just check them out. Most of them are increasingly in person. Some of them will still do call-in orders that you can then pick up. if you use black plastic to heat up the soil, do you eventually cover it with mulch so you don't make the soil too hot? Generally speaking, I don't see much of that. The plants will get big enough to shade the soil, but you can if you really wanted to. It's just a lot more labor intensive to get that off. Is it better to plant or spread tomatoes around the garden, or plant in one? Oh, that's an excellent question, Heather. Usually I don't see them spread around. Usually, since we recommend doing crop rotation and having different plants in different areas, or not having the same type of family plant in the same place year after year, it's better to just have them in a group. That way you can rotate them to another place in a later year. Alaskan fish fertilizer, Erin, it's going to be a source of nitrogen. You can definitely use it. Sometimes I wonder about the environmental impact of bringing something in, like importing something, if you're worried about that. But it's different sources of nutrient, which is essentially what Eric just said as well. Just make sure that there's good levels of nitrogen. And just as a repeat, our YouTube channel is, what is its name? It's Adams County Master Gardener. We'll post the link on our Facebook page as well, which is Adams County, or Colorado Master Gardener Adams County Extension. Local nursery over the big box stores. For the vegetables, it's really not going to be a big difference because they're all buying them from local greenhouse sellers as well. So, Peggy, what do you mean with nasturtium and basil? What are your questions on that? Class on melons and squash. We can definitely look into putting a class on melons and squash together. I love talking about them too. For companion planting, there's not a lot of research that shows there's much on companion planting. I do know one of my colleagues is putting together a talk for our Grow and Give website, and if you aren't familiar with Grow and Give, I'm going to put the web link in the chat. Grow and Give Colorado is our modern victory garden project that we've been working on really hard this spring in light of COVID-19. And we should soon have a companion planting talk up on there. Carol, I definitely understand that you want to get more for mountain communities. We do have, once again, on that Grow and Give Colorado website, we do have some content specifically for mountain gardening. I work on the Front Range, so that's where most of my talks are applied to. So definitely noted, and we try and do a little bit, or at least have a little nod to the higher elevation information as well. All right, any other questions for now? All right, thank you guys so much, and I hope I get to see all of you next week. Next week we are talking about, I don't remember. I think it is emerald ash borer next week. Yes, next week we will be a little bit more serious topic. We'll be talking about emerald ash borer, so definitely chime in if you get a chance. Thank you guys so much, and have a great day.